Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have with us here today Daphne Koller. Daphne was a professor of computer science at Stanford for over 18 years. She's the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award, among many, many other awards. She is the co-founder and former CEO of Coursera and the founder and CEO of a new venture called Insitro. I met Daphne right before Coursera launched, a few months before Coursera launched. I got on a phone with her with absolutely no intention of leaving my job, but then I heard her vision for Coursera and I couldn't not be part of it. So Daphne, thank you for that.
Thank you for joining us, Julia. The company would not have been the same without you.
Thanks for being here. So to start, you started Coursera over 7 years ago. The education and ed tech landscape was very different then. Yeah. Can you share a little bit about how it's evolved over that 7 years?
You know, I think it's been rather striking to see the evolution. When we first started doing this thing, online education was something that was very much at the fringe of higher education. Most institutions did not really engage with that. In many cases, it had almost a negative stigma among many institutions, especially among the elites. It was just not something that was ever conceived. You would go to a provost or a president and ask, what is your digital online strategy? And they would say, my what? And then I think over the years, as we started to really engage meaningfully with academic institutions and to provide them with this channel to reach a whole new group of learners that by and large did not ever been reaching before, most universities began to create a digital strategy office or an online education office. And I thought that was really exciting, but I think one of the exciting phenomena that we're seeing today is that, in fact, many institutions are disbanding that office because it becomes so much the part of their daily routine is that online is part of how they do business. So I think from that perspective, there's been a sea change. And then commensurately, from the learner perspective, we see a similar change, which is, again, online education used to be this thing that you learned how to cook something on YouTube or such. It wasn't a serious endeavor that provided you with seriously valuable credentials that could transform your life. Again, there's a few exceptions, but that really was, in many cases, the norm. And I think that to us today is inconceivable that this was how things used to be, given how many people are getting both small-scale micro-credentials, like the Coursera specializations and such, but even entire degrees from top institutions online. I don't think this would have been something that people would have conceived back in sort of 2011 when we got started.
Did you conceive it?
I don't think we realized just how quickly and how dramatically this would shift the landscape. I mean, I remember when we went and did the first pitch to the investors back in the fall of 2011, and we had a projection on the number of academic partners that we would have in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I think it got as high as like 20 at the end of it. And here we were about a year and a half after launch with over 100 partners. And that was just, and in 6 different continents. And I think that was just completely unexpected to me.
So Coursera now has 150 university partners, almost 40 million learners, significant revenue.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on both some of the mistakes that Coursera made along the way, as well as some of the things that Coursera got right.
So let me start with a mistake so I can continue with a high note. I think when we started Coursera, Andrew and I, together with some of the founding team, we were all incredibly inexperienced in the business world. We were all effectively academics. When we had, I think you remember, Julia, the leadership team meetings that we used to have, there were 5 of us. And among the 5 of us, we had a total of 2 years of business experience. That was your 2 years of Google. So that, with all due respect to those 2 years, it really wasn't very much. And I think it would have been better if we had hired earlier some people with a little bit more of the been there, done that. I think a lot of young founders think they can get it, they can figure it all out, and we figured a lot out, but there were many, many things that I think we could have figured out better if we'd had more seasoned leadership on board. One of the things, maybe following up from that we in fact did get wrong was was the focus. I think it always is easy for young founders or young teams to believe that they can do it all. I mean, this is such a great idea, and this is such a great idea, and in many cases in academia where your quanta of contribution is a paper, you could do many, many papers in the context of a year, but when you have the need to actually execute on a strategy and see it all the way through and have it make a difference, it's easy to underestimate just how much work and focus that takes and how mind share of the people in the company is just an incredibly precious resource. And we spread ourselves very thin. We had particular temptation to do that because of the high profile that we had. We got so many incredible offers of partnerships and new business models and new ways of having the platform make impact on the lives of so many people. And each of those on its own might have been a good idea, but as an ensemble, it was a terrible idea. So that was some of the things that we got wrong. I think the things that we got right was, maybe I'm going to highlight a couple things, was first of all, we never lost sight of the mission. We never lost sight of the fact that our goal here was to really live up to the Coursera vision, which is to enable people to transform their lives via access to an amazing learning experience. That was our vision statement, and we stuck to it despite pressures to monetize faster, better, charge people for access to content. There were all these pressures that I think we resisted, and without that, I don't think the company would have been where it is today, and it certainly would not have had the impact that it had and continues to have. So I think that's one thing that we did right. And then I think the other thing that we did right is that we didn't and it's maybe related, is that we continually pursued that North Star of what it was that we were looking to achieve and via what strategy, rather than jumping all over the next bandwagon or the next hot thing that someone would suggest. And I remember some of the early days of Coursera where we had, because of the success that we'd had, there were all these competitors cropping up, each with their own business model, and there were times when some of those seemed to be moving faster, better than ours, because those were the days when we were still trying to negotiate our very first university partnership agreements. And for those of you who've not negotiated with a university lawyer, I don't recommend it. And so it was a long and protracted process, and people were like, well, why don't we just throw all that away and do what this guy's doing, what that company's doing? It's like, no, this is our strategy. Here's why it's the right thing, and we're going to stick to it. And obviously, the fact that we've maintained this amazing partnership with the world's top institutions has allowed us to become who we were, bring tremendous values to those institutions, but most importantly, bring tremendous values to learners in terms of the quality of the content that we were able to provide, and then at the same time, the quality of the credential that really makes a difference to so many people.
On the topic of focus, you reminded me on our pre-call about how we, at one point, started a Coursera store.
Oh God, that was such a bad idea.
Which I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall between your conversation with John Doerr around MOOC monetization and the Coursera store.
Yeah, no, I don't even want to take you through that progression, but it was one of those ideas like, oh, it looks like a good idea at the time. No, it was a bad idea. I mean, honestly, it was a bad idea in its own, but also a bad idea in how it created yet another thing that took our attention away from what really mattered.
A major decision that you did make while you were at Coursera in the early years was leaving your tenured job at Stanford to become a full-time entrepreneur. Right. Can you share a little bit about that decision?
So I'd been at Stanford by the time I left for Coursera for, 95, 2012, so about 17 years, and while every new paper and every new grad student was exciting in many ways, it began to feel like a little bit of more of the same, but maybe more importantly, I became rather frustrated at the fact that the only impact I could have was, at second hand or third hand. So I could train great students who would go off and do stuff in the world. I could write papers and hope that people would read them and do something with the ideas and actually have them influence the lives of people. But I myself couldn't actually make people's lives better. And when the first MOOCs launched back in the fall of 2011, and we saw that not only were each of those MOOCs reaching 100,000 people or more, what was more important is that these were people not like our very privileged Stanford students, but people from every country and every age group and every walk of life whose lives were being touched by access to education and in many cases transformed. And so when that was to me the reason for leaving Stanford on what was supposed to be a 2-year leave of absence. And everything was structured around, okay, we're going to do this full time for 2 years, then at the end of that I'll come back to Stanford and I'll maintain the 1 day a week involvement that most faculty members keep with their corporate progeny, so to speak. And when those 2 years came to an end, the company was still in a very vulnerable state. I mean, this was the time that, let's say, many universities were scared, even though we'd never done anything to foster that fear that we were going to put them out of business. That was never the goal, and in fact would have been a horrible thing for us if it had happened, given the symbiosis. But it was very much a matter of if I left, there was a concern that, because I held most of those relationships, that we wouldn't be able to sustain that partnership despite my departure. And at the same time, I was just having so much fun in just making an impact on the lives of people. One of the things that we did at Coursera relatively early on, and you probably remember this, Julia, was that we started at every Friday's all hands reading a learner story. Usually something that came in on the forums or on email where a learner told, not even necessarily us, because sometimes it was in the forums, how this access to this learning experience had completely transformed their life. And we read those out. I still remember, I have the first one pretty much memorized. I read that one. It was from a forum post called Coursera Saved My Life. And it was about a young woman who had been very much in a traditional background, gotten married early, was constantly either pregnant or breastfeeding or both, and had never been able to pursue a traditional academic career, even though she was clearly incredibly bright and motivated. And she tried to commit suicide. And then her next sentence was, but we humans are very resistant of life, and I survived. Very resilient of life, and I survived. And then I found Coursera. And she goes on to talk about how it had given her hope and the sort of opportunity to gain a learning experience despite the constraints on her existence. And that now she was confident that when her children were grown up, she would go and attend Oxford, and she slept with a picture of Oxford under her pillow. I don't know if she'll ever attend Oxford, but it had given her hope. And so the fact that we were able to do something like that, not just for her, but for so many people, in a way that really transformed her life and their lives, was not something that I could just risk by going back to Stanford and writing some more papers.
Do you recommend when you talk to grad students or you're talking to other PhDs, do you recommend they go down an entrepreneurial path or an academic path, or how do you?
I think people have different callings in life, and also different callings at different times of their life. Many people, as I was at a young age, are very enamored by the intellectual joy of tackling really hard problems and maybe care less about whether it's going to have an immediate impact. And many of those inventions that came out of academia turned out down the line to have had tremendous impact. And I think some people are fine with the possibility that that may or may not happen, but they get a joy out of solving these really hard problems. And other people really care a lot more about, I really want to make a difference and I want to feel that difference being made viscerally and directly. And for those people, I think it's, an entrepreneurial career is maybe a better match. So different people need to do different things, and I'm very glad I had the time that I had at Stanford and the students that I was able to train, and many of them went on to do remarkable things. So I don't regret that time, but I'm very happy that I had the opportunity, maybe because I started early, to have a second chapter where I really do get to have that, that impact on people much more directly.
So with that, I'd love to hear about your current entrepreneurial endeavor.
Yeah.
There's a quote that was used about Coursera by Thomas Friedman back in 2012. And he said, "Big breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary." And that's something that can also apply to your current venture. So can you explain what is your current venture and how that quote applies?
So I love that quote. In fact, it's on our website at insitro because it is so, it captures so well what I look for when I try and do things, which is trying to solve a really big need with something that is like a new way of tackling that really big need. And at Coursera, we did that. I mean, the big need, which every one of you, I think, in this audience resonates with, is the need to offer a more accessible, high-quality education to many more people worldwide. And the thing that made it possible was both the technology, which was the ability to create effectively a zero-cost digital good, zero marginal cost digital good, so that once you created the basic content, offering it to additional learners was a tiny incremental cost, and it made education accessible. That plus the willingness by top institutions to partner with us and really put some of their closely held content online in a way that was available to so many more people. So that was, I think, a big, that was the sort of the suddenly possible part of the Thomas Friedman quote in the Coursera days. What we're looking to do now is try and do something similar in the context of health, which is another huge societal need. I'm sure all of us have had health issues either directly or in our family, and certainly if we haven't up until now, trust me, as you get older, chances are you will. And so how do we make healthcare so much more affordable and accessible to people? I grew up in the riding the tidal wave, if you will, of what's called Moore's Law, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It's the exponential increase in productivity of technology that's driven by our ability to create faster and faster computers that grow exponentially faster every year. It turns out that drug development R&D is under the shadow of what's called Eroom's law, which is, you notice, is the anagram of Moore's law, which is that the number of drugs that are approved per $1 billion of spending decreases exponentially year on year for the last 30 years. That's a very bad statistic, and it's not because the amount of need has decreased over time. There's still many diseases that have huge unmet need. And so the question is, are there technologies that we can bring to bear that might help break that curve? And I'm hopeful that the answer to that is yes, and that the confluence of two factors makes that possible. One is the availability of big data. So in the last few years, there has been a total sea change in our ability to measure biology at scale in highly rigorous and quantified ways. And so it includes the ability to engineer cellular systems that really recapitulate a meaningful part of human disease. So the ability, for instance, to take a skin cell from any one of us, convert that to a stem cell, turn it back not only into a neural cell, but into like entire little cerebral organoid with electrical activity that captures the fundamental genetics of a certain component of our neural circuits. And so is that something that you can now use to create disease models for instance, genetically inherited diseases and try and find drugs that potentially are disease modifying for everything from neurodegeneration to neuropsychiatric diseases. And that's just, you could do that not just for neurons, you can do that for other cell types, for cardiomyocytes, for heart disease, for kidney, for liver, for many other types of organs and other kinds of diseases. So you can create those systems, you can measure them in hugely rich ways with microscopy and RNA sequencing and many other modalities. But the other big transformation that's happened is the ability to then interpret those data using machine learning algorithms, and that's something that I've been doing for pretty much most of my career. And so the confluence of the ability to create large amounts of data and the ability to interpret those large amounts of data in terms of what interventions actually might make a difference to the disease, I think is one of those enabling technologies and would capture the suddenly possible part of the Tom Friedman quote, combined with the desperately necessary, which is the Eroom's law.
Are there specific diseases that you can share that you're working on? Or if you can't share that, what
Not
are the
yet.
types of, just to give the audience a sense, like what are the types of diseases that you would be excited about working on?
So I think it's clear that there are huge unmet needs in a couple different areas that, I mean, there's more obviously, but when you look at some of the big ones, so the whole sort of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, which is poised to become one of the biggest killers. I mean, it's somewhat self-inflicted in terms of the diet that we feed ourselves and the lack of exercise, but the fact of the matter is that these are horrible diseases that are killing more and more people every year. And so are there things that we can do besides the statins that will help reverse the course of this terrible family of diseases? And then the other one, of course, I think is obvious, is the whole family of CNS disorders, by which I actually am going to break that down into two. There's the neurodegenerative diseases, the number of people who are dying from dementias of different kinds, most notably Alzheimer's, but not just Alzheimer's, has been growing incredibly rapidly, partly because of the fact that we have prevented, to a certain extent, deaths from other causes that occurred earlier, like cancer and cardiovascular disease. So now we're starting to hit the next big killer, which are neurodegenerative diseases, and partly because those same lifestyle changes that I mentioned earlier also contribute to the neurodegenerative diseases. And then the other category of CNS diseases that also have a huge unmet need is the whole neuropsychiatrics, and those are, things like depression and schizophrenia and many other diseases that honestly have gone, in many cases, undertreated because in some cases of just the social stigma associated with those. But there's a growing recognition that those are diseases with a strong physiological basis. The heritability of schizophrenia is about 70%, 50 to 70%. So there's clearly a physiological basis there. It's not just people who don't want to, behave well. I mean, this is a real disease, and it's got very few cures, and I guess that's accompanying music. Anyway, and I think those are many diseases for which there is a huge need, to a large extent because the model systems that we've used to try and find cures for other diseases, which are typically animal models, are just horrendous models for those diseases. So the standard animal model, I just found this out a couple of months ago, the animal model for depression, which is a disease that strikes tens of millions of people just in the United States, is you take a mouse, I kid you not, you take a mouse and you put it in a pool and you force it to swim until it gets tired and it gives up and it drowns. And the premise is that if you give it an antidepressant, it'll swim longer, and therefore it's a depression cure. I mean, you could put a mouse on methamphetamine and it will swim longer. Does that make it an antidepressant? And so we lack, I mean, it's not because people are stupid, it's because we have not had really good models for those diseases. And so the question is, can some of those in vitro models provide an alternative path when combined with the right way of interpreting the data from those models?
Insitro really speaks to the potential of AI, especially in our sector. There's also a lot of hype around AI.
Way too much.
Can you, as one of the leading experts in AI, can you sort of break down for us what's real, like what is the potential, and what are the real risks that we should be thinking about? I mean, you can't go a day without reading an article about the robots coming and they're going to take all of our jobs. So can you break it down?
So just as a general rule, I have an allergic reaction to hype. And for those of you who go back to read some of the earlier media around Coursera, you will see that despite the incredible amount of hype that existed around MOOCs are going to put universities out of business. None of those quotes came from Coursera people. So we were always very, I think, tried to be very balanced and muted in the promises that were made, because I think I generally prefer to under-promise and over-deliver. I think in the context of AI, the amount of hype is very large, and I would say unfortunate, because one of my concerns that I have around the hype cycle is that even when you have meaningful impact on society, which I think machine learning has definitely demonstrated over the last 5 years in terms of how it's permeated so much of what we do and how it's made so many lives better. So there's been real impact, but when the hype so greatly exceeds even what's been done, it can taint and diminish from what's been done, because people get disappointed because the hype is not something one can live up to. So in terms of where I think the risks are, I would say there is a real risk to jobs, more and more jobs over time. Now that's been true for many of the previous revolutions, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and history has shown that new job categories emerge as old ones disappear. There are people who have a legitimate argument that this revolution might be different, but I don't think anyone really knows one way or the other. But that's definitely something that one ought to keep track of as a potential risk of AI. The other big risk that's touted is computers are going to become so intelligent that they're going to take over and just, like the Terminator movie type thing. I don't know very many, or hardly any, serious AI researchers who perceive this to be on the meaningful horizon. Right now, machines are really good at pattern matching input to output. So when you see computers being able to caption images that look at a natural scene and say, oh, these are 3 dogs playing frisbee on the beach and a girl building a sandcastle, the computer has no conception of what are dogs and what's a sandcastle and what's a girl. It's doing a pure input to output mapping. It's seen enough images where there's been little patches of texture that are dog-like that it knows that it needs to put the dog somewhere in the caption. So from that to meaningful human-level intelligence, there is a huge gap which I would say would take at least one and maybe more than one complete shift in how we do things in order to get us from where we are today to meaningful human-level intelligence. So where I would say that there is a risk, however, which I don't think is unique to AI but is exacerbated by AI, is that the systems that we're building are just increasingly complex. The computer systems and even the societal systems that we're building are increasingly complex to the point that their behavior becomes unpredictable. And that means that small changes in how a program was designed could lead to potentially huge negative impacts that are unforeseen, or that a evil person could sort of, by breaking into the system and modifying its behavior a little bit, could give rise to those, again, negative circumstances. This is true not just for AI. I mean, if you think about our stock market and some of the financial crises that have spiraled out of control, you think about our energy grid and the opportunity that someone would have to break into the energy grid and completely break it down. Those are risks that arise from complexity, and machine learning-based systems or AI-based systems are just one example of just a very complex system. So those are where I see the big risks, as opposed to, these are going to be Terminator-like robots that are going to want to, take over the world. I don't think we're anywhere close to that.
Great. Well, I have a few more questions, but I also want to open it up to the audience, and then I'll put some more questions in there. If we can get a mic.
One over there.
Let's just.
Early on, Coursera seemed to be 90, sometimes 90+% of the students who started and probably were happy because it didn't cost anything, but never got through.
True.
How's that doing?
I don't have the most recent statistics. My expectation is that it hasn't actually changed dramatically, and I think the reason for that is that by and large people don't intend to finish these courses when they begin. This is a very different experience than the one that you get when you go to college, you pay huge tuition, there is a big sort of, the credential at the end, and you're all working toward that. Then you go in with the intent to complete. Most of the people who took Coursera classes came in with the intent of, this is really cool and I want to learn something about this. So I'll give an example. I recently was reading the Sapiens book, and I got through about 2/3 of it. I think it's an amazing book. I didn't finish the last third. Is that a damnation of Yuval Harari's writing? I don't think so. It's just a matter of I got a lot out of that experience, and I'm very happy I had that. So I think a lot of people who took Coursera classes went in with that mindset, and people just confused it with a university experience, and were holding that to the same standard. I think a more reasonable metric would be to look at those people who signed up for a credential and ask how many of those completed the courses. And there the statistics were about 60 to 70% depending on the course. And now we're talking about a financial commitment of about $50. So it's nowhere close to what you would pay for university education. And if you look at some of the degrees that are now offered on Coursera, like University of Illinois IMBA, which is our first degree program, the completion rates there are well into the 90s. So even though it's an online experience, and that's because it's a population of people who A, went in with the intent to complete, and B, have some skin in the game in the sense of they're actually paying tuition. And I think that's a much more reasonable benchmark to compare to the university experience.
Thank you, Professor Koller. I have a question on big data and personalized learning. So I think part of the vision when you founded Coursera was also to mine the data of the learners and also maybe the teachers and provide a more personalized learning experience compared to perhaps the offline experience of going to a university that is usually facilitated by large-scale lectures. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you are spending more time now in the medical field. So I wonder whether it's because this system of mining data and delivering personalized learning is quite mature for Coursera, that it is kind of automatically running, or is it because you have encountered some local extremity or local challenge that's not easily solved for the foreseeable future that you switch to another industry?
Yeah, so let me try and answer that in pieces. First of all, about the opportunity to use big data to provide a personalized learning experience. I think there is potentially a big opportunity there, and I would say it's one that we've barely scratched the surface of at Coursera, and I would think, to my knowledge, in other online education enterprises as well, it's something that we barely scratched the surface of. It turns out to be challenging for a number of reasons, especially in the context of Coursera, where we're not actually in control of the content. The partner is in control of the content, and getting instructors to design their content around something that is a more personalizable learning experience is challenging, especially given the amount of work that it takes to design an online course to begin with. So you're already asking them to take on a huge effort, and they have their day job to do. This is typically on top of what they're doing in their university lives. And so it's not been easy to create the sort of scaffolding on which one can then create a meaningful personalized learning experience. I think we've done some of that, but I agree with you that there is a lot more to be done. I don't think that was the reason why I ended up making the career change that I did. I think that for those of you who look back at the history that I have in my career prior to Coursera, this is what I was doing before Coursera. I mean, I'd been doing machine learning long before it was popular, so this was back in the early 90s. I'd been doing machine learning applied to the healthcare space back as early as the late 90s, so the time of the earliest microarray data, the earliest human genome project, and I put that on hold because I thought the Coursera opportunity for impact was too large for me to pass up. But then, when 2016 came around, and I'd been doing Coursera for about 5 years, since 2011, and it was it was doing really well, and you know, we had 150 universities, several thousand courses, and at that point, I think 20-some million learners, I forget the exact amount, and I felt like the incremental impact that I could bring if I stayed on at Coursera, while not insignificant, was nowhere near as large as what I could do by going into a space where there was an opportunity to just do something that really was incredibly challenging. And so let me just maybe elaborate on that a little bit. To me, the two biggest obstacles to the use of machine learning in the healthcare space has been twofold. One is that up until quite recently, a big data set in biology or health was a couple hundred samples. And when you have a couple hundred samples, honestly, it doesn't much matter what machine learning algorithm you use. They all perform about the same, and they all perform kind of and so that really didn't exist when I went to Coursera. But the second one, which speaks to the point of why I made this transition, is that the second big gap is that there is an almost complete lack of what I would call bilingual people. People who speak machine learning and biology both fluently and are able to see how you could bring those two together in meaningful ways. If you ask a biologist who doesn't know machine learning, what problems can machine learning solve for you, they will say, well, I usually go from A to B to C to D, so can you help me go from A to B a little bit faster, because this is an annoying step that I want someone to automate for me. Good, but not transformative in most cases. You ask a machine learner who doesn't know biology, what can machine learning do for biology? And say, well, I have no idea what this table means, but it has 37 columns, so can I predict column 37 from 1 through 36? Unlikely to be in any way a meaningful problem. So creating that sort of group of people that can really speak both languages and identify important opportunities where machine learning can play a role in life sciences is really a very underpopulated space. And I'm one of the few people who've actually been doing this for most of my career. And I thought that if I left Coursera, it would continue to do just great. If I didn't found insitro, it wouldn't exist. So I don't know how. Simone.
Hi, I'm Simone Wijsbeek. I'm VP Education at Imperial College in London. And I actually knew Daphne from my previous job at Leiden University. I was one of the first universities to basically get involved
honored
with Coursera, and it's been a wonderful adventure. Right now, Imperial and other universities are moving into fully online master degrees, and hopefully at some point bachelor degrees as well. And for me, that's really the next step that can change the face of education globally. I want to ask you how you think we can really change the world and focus on low and middle income countries and make sure that under-serviced populations of young people get the education they need to change their countries and really tackle all the sustainable development goals and the global challenges. Because I think Coursera and other platforms still cater primarily, and not because they want to, but that's just how it is, to people in the West who already have a degree and then get one on top. And I think we really need to change the way we work if we want to change the world, which is what you started thinking about. So how do you see we can together enter into this new era?
Yeah, no, I think that's a terrific question. And I think you're right that degrees are a fundamental aspect of how we can make that happen. One of the things that we really need to do is to really bring down the cost of the degrees as they are offered to people in developing countries. In order to do that, I think we need to automate a lot of the expensive steps as we offer those courses. For instance, the grading, the student support services, and so on. And I think that is a place where big data and machine learning can play a role, as well as some of the industrialization of the processes, so that you create a cadre of teaching assistants, if you will, that are maybe even from within that country who have graduated from those courses. It offers them an opportunity for incremental income, but they also frankly get paid less than the similar teaching assistant would get paid in the US or in the UK. And so it actually helps address both of those issues. So how do you create that ecosystem that really allows the courses to be offered at scale? Because the artisanal approach that we've employed in education, where one professor teaches 20 or 30 or even 200 students, is not going to be cost effective for offering an education in those countries. So I think we need to think creatively about those aspects of scaling that involve both automation and those other components as well.
I think we can do one last question. Yes.
I think it's an incredibly important thing. It's the engine for innovation. It's also the engine for training new researchers who will then either go into academia or become entrepreneurs and take some of their ideas into the real world. And I think it's absolutely critical that we preserve that and continue to fund it.
Having made the change from academia to business, don't you think some of the big companies are taking over that job of research, including ASU and insitro?
Well, I think there is definitely a huge sucking sound from industry, and a lot of academics are being drawn into that. I don't think that's necessarily bad in sort of its entirety, because many people are now being trained in research in an industrial setting, and that too is an engine for innovation. So I don't think it's bad in its entirety, and I think many people, kind of like me, end up going into academia for a certain portion of their career, whether it's their PhD or their PhD in postdoc or maybe early faculty life, and then make the transition. And that continues to put young people in a place where they can innovate without having to have a particular goal in mind. So I think it's important, however, that we continue to fund universities in ways that allow people to make those career steps, even if it's only for a part of their careers, as opposed to just leave it all entirely to industry. And I know a lot of people that would have wanted to stay in academia are making that transition because the funding situation by the NIH or the NSF is so dismal that they're unable to get the research agenda funded without a lot of pain and hardship, and so they go and work in industry. So I think this is something that government really ought to continue that investment while still not devaluing the level of the fact that innovation can also come from the industrial sector. So I think we need to keep a balance on both of these.
Great. Daphne, thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you.